And so if we say that love heals, we also have to say that art heals. Because the first step in becoming loving is to acknowledge that loving is an art, just as living is an art, which is what Fromm says. And if we want to learn how to love, we have to proceed as one who wants to learn an art form. And that is through theory, the mastery of practice, and in making mastery our utmost priority. And so while many therapists might agree that love has a role in the healing process, the word itself tends to be absent from therapeutic literature. But a truth about human suffering is that all our neurotic self-destructive patterns are what Wellwood calls forms of basic goodness which lie hidden within them. And so I really believe if loving someone is accepting and integrating the good with the bad, then that is essentially the same thing as mourning. And this means that every offense and selfish act inflicted on us or on someone else is in fact an act of love too, because it reveals and takes us to the places that need to be loved, to be grieved, to be integrated, to be revised, and or to be transformed. And so art making and creativity, in whatever modality you may practice, as defined by, let's say, image making and conjuring, or symbolism and symbolic play, metaphors, and the embodiment of expression, this all allows us to blur the boundaries between fantasy and reality, between real objects and internalized objects, and between inner and outer experiences, and also between love and loss. And so creativity allows for transcendence. And that's really the ability to hold dualities in our conscious awareness as paradoxes that do not require resolution. William James once said, "The greatest enemy of any one of our truths may be the rest of our truths." Paradoxes in our lives create tension in the rational mind. And this makes us uncomfortable, and it raises questions. And questions raised by conditions of life and death are soul-searching and hard to love because they really have no answers. But they establish a context for the way you see yourself in your relationship to the universe. It's how you create your own personal narrative, how you are constructing the story of your life. And so with this in mind, I came to incorporating meditation and visual journaling, because visual journaling is a medium that combines symbols with the construction of personal narrative. And because through this process we are able to make meaning of our experiences, and that allows us to achieve a sense of mastery over the most important loving relationship that you will ever have. And that is your relationship with yourself. And this is also the aim of a grief recovery model. And so I would like to just briefly touch upon what you can expect moving forward with this course. The protocol ultimately devised is very similar to the work of James and Friedman and Bradshaw. James and Friedman are the founders of the Grief Recovery Institute, and they wrote a great book called The Grief Recovery Handbook. And in it, early attachment relationships are suggested as a starting point for addressing the dynamics of current grief through the depiction of a loss history graph, for example. And so each relationship is then dealt with separately through an investigation of what they call several recovery components. And that includes gaining awareness that an incomplete emotional relationship exists, accepting responsibility that you're in part the cause of that incompleteness, identifying recovery communications that you have not delivered, taking actions to communicate them, and moving beyond loss and pain. John Bradshaw's theory of the wounded inner child is perhaps more popularly understood. But basically, it's when an individual's true self what I like to refer to as a person's essential artist, fails to be acknowledged, particularly in childhood. And so that child becomes emotionally wounded and his maturity remains stuck in a particular phase of development, ultimately developing a false self, a mask or persona, and that helps the child adapt to the demands of his or her parents. And so Bradshaw uses a developmental approach to grief, claiming that a person can't properly grieve or reclaim that inner child, their true self or essential artist, unless they address the significant losses of every phase of life. And so to do this, he uses interventions like guided meditations and letter writing, both of which I've included in this protocol. Keeping these frameworks in mind, I primarily approached this protocol through the frame of attachment theory and what I believe to be the intersections between attachment hunger and complicated grief. And those concepts are explored in greater detail in subsequent lessons. But the protocol's overall structure is a blend of mindfulness-based creative arts therapies interventions and a recovery model for grief. And so prior to each session directive, you'll find a written description of an important aspect of engaging with this work. And so I recommend engaging in this process in whatever way works for you. It could be reading the written descriptions and watching the tutorials first. It could be listening to these lectures on your iPhone on the way to work, and then coming home and reading the descriptions and doing the art making. Maybe you'd rather dive right into the meditations. The only thing I would say is that the experiential piece is really essential to truly understanding the depth of this work, particularly if you are going to be expanding this into your practice with others. So the only thing that I would tell you not to do is to skip any aspect of the experiential component. Additionally, the art therapy interventions and principles that went into the justifications for each directive are derived from a variety of sources. And so I do recommend that you follow the assignments in the order in which they are presented, but also feel free to take ownership of this process and make it distinctly yours. Because everyone's creative journey, like his or her grief, of course, is unique.